And today we will be diving a little deeper into Tim Stone's work. We're really excited to have him here and tell us a little bit more about what he does. And with that, I will hand it over to him. Welcome.
Thank you, Gretchen. Thanks for having me. Today, just gonna do a walk and talk and tell you a little bit about my work and practice. My work is kind of bemusedly real and fake, and that's in order to reflect sort of the kind of wishy-washy like example of truth that we all experience today. I use landscape as kind of like a staging area to talk about events that are taking place in our physical and social landscapes, and kind of like negative factors affecting them, such as natural disasters, climate change, wildfires, misinformation, religion can be problematic, and all this is reflected in the images I take and spaces I personally interact with that I feel are kind of like physical, visual examples of this change from one thing to another. So there's sort of like uncanny versions of real spaces I experience. I also like to, process is clearly really, it's kind of like really important to me. I like in the piece to show evidence of the physical process in the final version. There's kind of like a realness and a rawness to that, but equally I like to convey illusion and make the viewer like feel like they can enter these spaces and interact with them, and some sense of things that are recognizable, but it's also a little like cautionary. The color sort of tells you to like be careful, or there's a slight hesitation I want you to feel, and just sort of absorb these like factors that I'm presenting to you. So illusionistic space is really important, and kind of just like raw paint on the surface, taking you out of that illusion is too. I think that ties in well with the what is real, what is not real, and kind of like like what is true and what's not true. So yeah, this piece is a good example of that. Each piece kind of has a I like it to feel like it's never done really. It's like constantly in this stage of construction, or this like at a threshold between one point and the other. So yeah, this is when I was in LA. Usually it's like they follow where the spaces like I go and the places I go into, and I like it kind of merging into this like one world I'm creating that's reminiscent of our real one. So
can you tell us just a little bit more, like before we move on, about this piece in general?
Sure.
The title, and then a little bit more about what it's about.
Sure, yeah. I was kind of mentioning how I like the viewer to intimately sort of like enter these spaces and engage with them. I don't want there to be a lot of distractions, like other figures or like things that like we would see every day, but they're sort of eliminated so you can be into that. And sometimes that leads me to think of like, well, what happens where everything's gone, or like you're not seeing those things. And so there's somewhat like an apocalyptic feel sometimes where I want you to be like the only person in these spaces. Almost like, like the scene in like 28 Days Later, like coming out into London and there's nothing there. And it's like, what exactly happened? It's interesting to have kind of an ambiguity of like what exactly is going on. I don't always like that to be defined. So the titles sometimes come from that, or how I'm feeling at the time. This one's titled Aftermath, as if it's like after some sort of catastrophic event. And some of the colors also allude, like I was saying, to like wildfires. And I mean, when I started the series a couple years ago, like, I mean, it just seems like it's gotten worse and worse as climate change or like progresses, And like earlier this year, I was really inspired by just those, which I was making paintings of already, but just kind of like in California, just these like deep orange and red skies. And it's like, it's coming to fruition, this like apocalyptic sort of feel and disaster of our world right now. So my paintings don't seem to be as much of an exaggeration as they used to be, I feel like. So. Yeah.
Thanks.
It doesn't, it's kind of heavy with this one too, in that sense. And then, you know, it's taking those things and trying to artfully showcase them for real, you know, out of real concern too. And it's like, maybe my work can help to illustrate those points to those that really don't feel like they're happening or think things are lies when they're not, you know. And it's like, we all, like I personally, you know, it's a traverse the landscape of what is true and not true. And it's like, my painting is the outcome of those feelings for me sometimes also. This one, like, you know, it's not getting carried away with, but it really goes to sort of like an illusionistic or fakeness with the landscape. And I really wanted the process to be very like constructed in this abstract way of depicting it, but also like very real in the sense of like the forest is burning and the telephone pole sort of being reminiscent of a cross. That comes from where around here, you know, religion, Christianity is very prominent. You see this symbol, the symbols for these things a lot, and there's problematic issues, I feel like, with that. And it's just a lot of my work too, it's like trees, concrete, kind of architecture. It's just things I see every day, so it comes out in the work naturally. And that's one of those things. So
I know texture appears in your work a lot, and there is some in this. Can you just probably talk more about it?
Sure.
You can talk a little bit about how you use that.
Absolutely. So texture is important. I like to almost like usurp what I'm trying to do with illusion sometimes. So, you know, like plein air painting and other types of painting, it's to get at a pure illusionistic space outside of the material, kind of like the hide your brushstrokes thing. But I like that, but I like to fight against that with just like really sharp, palpable paint on the surface of the canvas. So you're getting this illusion, but you're also getting this like right on the surface, no lie, like absolute truth of the material. And it's like, I like how that ties in with the content of trying to decipher what is real and not real. I also like with my process, just try to keep things fresh and never settle on like a specific way to construct something. It keeps me inspired, and it like, I think keeps it fresh for the viewer too. And each painting is like a new discovery of like what I can keep doing with that. So it keeps it fun and interesting for me as well. And like, how can different ways of process, like, what does that evoke to the viewer? What is the feeling of how different things are made? I sometimes write and like to say like the first mark I make, sometimes it's like the last mark I make too. So the first thing can be the last thing, and it all ties together in that. And many of the spaces sort of, to me, are like illustrative of that idea of in between and like changing from one thing to the other. And yeah. So that's a little bit about that.
What was this one to the title?
So some of these titles came from the music I was listening to at the time, and this is an album, name of an album by a band from, I think, the Quad Cities called Stunning. They played in Wichita before, and it just, the album's called Fake Fake, and it just sort of tied in with the like, what is real, what is fake theme I'm dealing with, and like, you know, fake news, and mainly about, I guess, non-believing of climate change and how it seems absurd. So it's like fake news, like that realistic scientific evidence is thought to be fake by some, and like there's a fakeness in the trees and like the different things I'm creating in this, where it's like, you still think it's a tree, but it's like a fake tree maybe. And is it really on fire? Like, yes, some think no, I don't know. No in my painting, you know, because I'm just like alluding to that. So it kind of comes from all that. Yeah. This painting, it's, by the way, it was a great, great spot for it.
Yeah.
You can see it right when you come to the gallery. So it's that 1 point perspective.
No, I love it on that whole.
Yeah.
It looks great. As we're moving through, I forgot to mention at the beginning, if anyone had any questions, please submit them in the comments or the chat, and we will ask Tim those later when we get towards the end. Thanks.
Again, if you're talking about, this one's called So Monstrous and Final, and it's a lyric from a dismemberment plan song. And really just kind of about inevitability. And I was struggling with this one, and it's just like, you know, it's fighting against, I think like sometimes we fight against what is going to happen. So maybe it's really just about death in the end. But, you know, I like what the different things this one can be. It's also just about, you know, on your own, in your head, these quiet spaces that are endlessly vast, but also flat. So it kind of goes back to how I like to paint, the things I like to do in my painting, which is like push space and keep it flat. Just interesting kind of like combating themes that go along with the content as well. And it was kind of a good exercise in like creating a solid idea of everything coming together, but then just focusing on like one part of the process and kind of like keeping in your own head and just doing one thing regardless of what the outcome's going to be. And it's in 4 panels too for its size, but it also kind of seems like each panel sort of has its own, like, I was just focused on that at the time, I was just focused on this at the time, and it's a bit of like an escape from that sort of like influx of images and just like all the exposure we have and trying to decipher what is true and not true. So painting can also be like a good respite from everything. So it's all those things combined. Yeah.
So this one is for interior space, and I know a lot of your other ones deal with exterior space. Do you have any? It sounds like you maybe approach interior space a little differently. Maybe,
yeah. I think I mean, it can be seen that way. It's also like kind of expansive enough to where you don't. It is interior and does feel interior, but it could also not be. I think like if it defines too much as interior, I'm not liking that as much. There needs to be a kind of like a window of escape, which I feel like this one does, and then the next one, which is clearly more of an interior space, has that for me. I think that's something I'm still kind of like working out as to what interior versus exterior, like exactly how I want to define those. So that's something that's kind of in the works. Yeah. But there is something different, like there's a different feeling with them. You get sort of a more enclosure with the interior, and the outerior seems a little more vast, I guess. I don't know. How does
I mean, it creates this amazing space. Yeah.
Yeah. How do you see them differently, or how does it affect you?
Well, I feel like this one is more architectural, because obviously all the architectural elements. But I think like you were talking about, kind of more the introspective part of it, or thinking more like internally, like when you approach these things. Yeah, you're looking kind of at that, where all the pieces, like the vanishing perspective, where they all converge on the end, where, yeah, like in I think the exterior pieces, you're looking more at this open, like vast area. So. Yeah,
and I mean, I like the fact that, you know, we're looking at them as actual interior and exterior spaces, but I also just think it's kind of a stage to discuss these things, and like it's a metaphor for like our landscapes that we're exposed to. Like the landscape is a metaphor for physical and the social landscape and like the issues affecting us.
We do have one question come up that I think refers specifically to this. So it asks, when you focus solely on one portion, and I'm assuming section of the painting, is that a way that you can move beyond the struggling that you mentioned?
Kind of, yeah. It's a way to sort of, you can kind of get into something that's more meticulous. Not that your brain shuts off, but I'm not feeling like the weight of every piece in this exhibition. And you're thinking about it, but sometimes when creating the piece, you can just get into those little fine details, those little corners, and you can just go and like assess what it means afterward. Because with paint especially, you know, stuff can be discarded. Nothing's like precious all the time, but like, what's it do when you can shut off a bit and focus on one thing? And I think that's helpful too. Like, so you're not carrying the weight of the entire exhibition with every piece you make, because I think that's gonna inhibit like creativity. It's gonna inhibit like interesting things that can happen in the moment if you're like trying to say like, well, this isn't gonna fit with this other thing because like it's talking about this or whatever. So it doesn't always work, but it unlocks like special happenings, I think, within the work sometimes. Yeah.
I think that's great. I think when, especially on that scale, like it can be difficult to think of the whole thing and to be able to work on like piece by piece.
Right. Yeah.
I have another question.
Okay.
I don't know if it isn't really specific for this piece, but it asks to talk about your choice of acrylic and oil and how that plays into the process of your work.
Okay. Yeah. Like the acrylic it's an easier medium to work with in the sense of it's going to dry faster. It's not as toxic. It's just like a little more, just kind of like flows better. It's safer. And I like, that can be used to like really get some like solid kind of flat colors. And then the oil spreads easier and it's more atmospheric. So you can kind of get that play of like flatness and pushing space specifically with the two paints. The work gets created faster, I think. And like, it allows me to spend a little more time creating because I know what the material is going to do and I don't have to like wait and I can just like go and there's a quickness to it that I like. So, yeah, I just tend to, it's like, I don't mind kind of like mixing different types. I use spray paint also in that same way. So it's not like staying precious to specifically being like an oil painter. I'm kind of like subverting the idea of like painting in like a high class, I think. And it's like more just like using it to get an idea out, not worrying like that has to be this oil painting that's like very fine art or something. Yeah. So, and yeah, I just like mixing all that stuff together. So, it's a good question.
Yeah. I do have one comment from Matthew Hilliard. He says, congrats on your exhibition.
No, thanks, Matt.
Are we?
Either one.
Okay.
I'm in the middle.
Okay.
We can talk about this one. There might be a few. This one's a bit different, I'd say. Speaking of kind of getting in and focusing and not worrying about the other paintings. This is pretty majorly inspired by the collage work, which we'll look at in a little bit. And it's got that kind of like, the collage work comes from any material, really, any printed material, mainly magazines, and cutting around figures and like ads to get, you know, like atmosphere and landscape and architecture and things like you see in my paintings, but then I create new invented spaces that didn't exist before I made it, yet they still like look like they reference our world. We can get there, but this painting was inspired actually by that work. So it's the first time I had, instead of being inspired by my painting and doing that, I like reversed it. And it's very much an interior space, if we're gonna go back to like what that means versus the exterior. But it's titled Untitled Aberration because there's like this happening or like undeniable mark that seems like it could be an object. Obviously it's casting a shadow, but it's also could be a window or it's very flat. It's ambiguous exactly what it is. So it is and it isn't doing things, and I like that idea of like the viewer having to confront that and decide, I guess, make their own mind up, or maybe thinking like they're not right and they'd like to hear what I have to say about it. But I feel like I'm putting myself in their shoes when I was making it too. So yeah, and I like when things just kind of like can have a impact. The bright colors, and I use acrylic for that, like it has this impact, but it also feeds into my anxieties and just like my caution of events unfolding as they are right now. So it's kind of like to draw people in and then to make them question and wonder. So, yeah. And I kind of like the piece. It's fun dealing with, you know, I'm subverting actuality of like how light and shadow are dealt with sometimes in order to fuel the content. But just as a painter and as an artist, it's nice to be able to like work with those things too and figure out real life in a sense, you know, like still life painting and drawing and just like things as we build skills as an artist and like continue to use those skills I enjoy. So it's kind of like that a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah.
And this piece is similar. I like that they were hung side by side because I think there's a relationship visually, at least, and with this kind of cutout color that doesn't seem to go with anything else. This one's got a bit of a narrative that I was just thinking about. It's sort of inspired by those utilitarian yet somewhat mundane, just like spray painting on curbs, pointing to like fire or water type stuff. And I just got to thinking like further into the future, like how important sources of water might be. So it just sort of this narrative built in my head. And I guess by painting it larger, it seems like more important than like obscure spray on the sidewalk. But I'm also inspired by those mundane moments and happenings. So it's kind of like a mixture of the two. It's also a way to just, each painting's another chance, I guess, for me to try a different method of process and see how things are going to work. It was a fun one to do, regardless of its like success per se with measuring up to some of the other pieces. But
can you talk a little bit about the process of layering in both of these pieces?
Yeah, often the thing that is going to stick out the most in the painting is like the first part of the process. So like the orange interruption objects window in this one, and then the reference to the spray paint water valve. So I put a lot of stuff down like that I want to pop out in the end. So I use a lot of tape and you know, a lot of tape and different layers of paint, and then like paint that's going to blend, but then paint that's very hard edge and sharp, often referencing the architectural elements. It's fun for me to see how all those things come together and like the differences, yet the relationships between them. So instead of just like starting a painting where it's like layer 1, 2, 3, like building it, I build some and I take some away and then build some back, maybe taking more away and blending some out. So it's just like a kind of like smorgasbord of different ways of painting. Yeah.
Like in that one, the orange is the base.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and that's a good way to get like vibrancy sometimes. Yeah. Like you, somewhat painting 101 sometimes, very bright colors at first and often very thin layers, and it really kind of creates this like translucency glow. I really like that in for atmosphere and spatial things and like glow of wildfires. So you know, like I'm not just doing it because it might be interesting or kind of an exploration of process. Like it really does aid the things I want to like seem like they are, you know, like the illusionistic things, like the process really helps with that. Yeah.
There's a lot of color theory wrapped up in that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. It's in the, I think as artists, like, I mean, we're not always thinking about it, but it's in there, right? Like we've learned the color theory, we've learned compositional rules. If I like strained myself to always try to like do all that in one painting, I don't think they would come out in like a fresh, interesting way, right? So, yeah.
Cool. Okay.
Actually, I have some small work here, so smaller. Yeah, I have to get up a little closer. So quite a little bit different than my paintings. The collage work was started when I was in a, I guess, more constrictive space, and kind of, you know, just thinking about the ideas of climate change and trying to reuse materials and not be as wasteful. I started creating these collages, and it's like, I call them invented landscapes because they're I kind of enjoy the fact they're entirely fictional of my own invention, but I mean, there's real buildings and like there's real references from the imagery to our world. So I liked that play. And it was just like fun to create these compositions. I started realizing based on the material and then like for the content, how it could tie into climate change. It eventually moved on to pieces referencing the rising of the sea levels. And with this piece specifically, I was thinking about, again, our area of how like it used to be an ocean and it very well could be again. So I wanted to sort of create a series with collage that worked in that of like messing with time and like, was it in the past, was it in the future? And there's like a whole broad like spectrum to play with there. And I think the collage with material on top of it's like a really good medium to express that and explore that idea. So I also like it. It's very interesting, especially with the glass over it. It's got this kind of like aquarium feel, as if like we're outside of the world that I'm talking about being flooded, and it's like we, you know, trying to take the viewer out of that and see like, look, this could happen, and then like that's where you're in right now, actually, you know. And I kind of like that way to observe it. Really, I don't know. It's interesting to me. And then it's like, you know, it's like as if you were able to slice it and it's got like two dueling horizons or something. So there's a lot to explore here. I'm excited to do that right now. I enjoy this piece quite a bit.
Okay. Did you talk a little bit about the oil pastels in these?
I just kind of said like a material, but yeah, generally it's oil pastel going over the collage material. I've gone less and less from that. It was necessary here, I think, to kind of get like a blend of translucent water. But there's a piece over here, which we can go over to in a sec, that's entirely just collage. It's got a little bit different feel. I think like what I like about the paintings in the process is when it feels raw and fresh, and it's a little bit fresher perhaps, or more raw, not as like calculated sometimes. They all have sort of like evidence of like flooding, which is referencing climate change, but it might kind of like what's supposed to be atmosphere becomes a little more like objects too. So I think it takes the viewer a little longer to decipher what's like the object versus the atmosphere and the figure ground relationships.
I have a question.
Sure.
That asks, I have always seen your work as essentially surreal. did you or do you discuss it from that point of view?
I really don't think so. I think like by surreal, I'm kind of talking about like what's real and what's not. So it's very in terms of like this is fake or this is real, and then I do merge it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not gonna sit here and I won't deny that there's you could look at it that way as surrealism, and yeah, I mean like if someone said that, I wouldn't say no, it's not. You know? But yeah, there like I think that sort of is not inherent, but for me, within the process of painting and how paint is, it's kind of hard to like, unless you're specifically trying not to get away from that, because the paint is I mean, it's painting and it is an illusion, and that kind of surrealism is kind of guides to that, and like it's sort of they have this like relationship, I think, this sort of like harmonious relationship with each other. So I mean, I think the piece we're going to look at last is not surreal at all,
right.
But I definitely see it coming into some of it, yeah.
And I don't, if you mentioned this already, I'm sorry.
No, it's cool.
The collages are relatively recent. Can you talk about kind of like the years?
It's probably started about 2 years ago. The series is numbered, so I'm up to like in the 70s now. It's invented landscape, number, and then the next collage. Yeah, it's like, it's just kind of started out of necessity of needing to make. And I think there's things I can learn from it. So I'm going to continue it, especially with talking about climate change. Mm-hmm. But it influenced the big painting with like the orange interruption. So I think I'm going to continue it for sure. Yeah. It's a fairly recent development, but like that's how painting goes too. It's just by normal painting. Like, it's like you got to keep it fresh like that, and I think this is just like another kind of example of keeping things fresh. So yeah, and this is a better example of the collage combining with the oil pastel. But there is the power to those parts that kind of stand out. I think if everything is blended, it kind of hides like what like the collage is speaking, you know, how it's like speaking and reading, I think, a little bit. Right. Visually.
And I think you had mentioned when you were here before that this was maybe one of the earlier ones.
Yeah.
Yeah. So again, moving from this kind of heavily blended oil pastel mm-hmm. to something where, like the last one we looked at, where it's kind of the more the crisp edges.
Absolutely, yeah. I wonder how much there's inspiration from like early Windows screensavers and like programs, you know, like what are these like kind of oddly fake sort of like trying to be too beautiful scenes or whatever. Yeah, it's like just in there.
This one for me, I feel like is the most surreal. Like this one, I see all of those like elements
definitely
more, and I don't know if that's the blending or
it's got
different parts of it.
It's got to be that combination of like the highly defined sort of photographic image, especially, you know, magazines like National Geographic, and then this sort of more soft blended kind of blanket that surrounds it, but then you still see it like sticking out of it in places.
This might be just a good opportunity. I think you talked a little bit about with some of your other pieces about this, just the process in general, like, yeah, like it's not just making one collage and being like, oh, I made a collage, but like starting from this point and experimenting and thinking and going back to it again and again.
Yeah, I mean, like it seems to me there's no other way. If it's a one-off collage, it doesn't seem important in that way. It's kind of like, well, I see one, what's the rest of that world, or like different worlds, and like how does it connect to the next piece and the next piece? And I think in creating the first one, it's like it was already going to be a series. There was no doubt about it. I mean, it doesn't mean that it couldn't end or definitely improve, or if it's not good enough, like stop. But it's like, I think the point is having a whole series of them. I think if it's just one, it doesn't read to me as well. It's for some reason, it seems like a one-off kind of like hobby or something.
I think there's that like continuous learning, like it's just always kind of looking for what can be different, what can be changed.
Yeah.
Yeah, which I think it's great, I think, to be able to see those.
And maybe like
changes.
talking about like not being restricted or trying to think of everything as a whole and like the weight of that. Like it's it was a good way to explore and see what things can be. And it's like was somewhat freeing and untethered from the content of the rest of the work a bit. Yeah. So.
Should we move on?
Sure. So this was just a piece that I struggled with this piece, but in the end I felt it was important enough to kind of showcase how I felt or what was represented, what was actually representational of our current American flag, and maybe a bit of frustration of sort of how people chose to use it or like use that symbol in ways that like benefit their way of thinking that might not think about everyone as a whole. It's also like, just like all the work, there's an influence from like my area, my culture, the geographic area I live, where you see confusing uses and like, you see like depictions of multiple flags together that are antithetical in my opinion and like should represent other things, but maybe this piece was kind of like a realization of like the flag really does represent hateful ideas along with good things it represents, and this sort of like peeling away to reveal that. It's also, to me, it's somewhat hopeful in the sense that like it could all be peeled away and built anew of like what it truly should represent. But right now, this is like what we're dealing with. So it's just like kind of like what I saw as an honest approach to like visualize that and like confront that, I guess. Like it's a pretty confrontational piece in that sense. So it's important enough to do, but it's still uncomfortable when depicting symbols of hatred. But in the end, like, you know, talking with Gretchen and displaying it here seems like an important thing to do. So that's kind of where I'm at on it.
One of the things that I find incredibly interesting about this piece in general, I think it grew out a little bit of from your use of tape.
Yeah.
And we could talk a little bit more about how you've used that kind of with other works. Mm-hmm. But I'd also like you to talk a little bit about the impermanence of that tape.
Absolutely. So tape, which I think I mentioned earlier, just a huge part of the process, but I started viewing it hanging on the wall of the studio, and like there's this kind of like beautiful yet temporary moments within that, and that was like a big part of the work too, is like moments and like spaces that are in change and just like trying to capture those moments. And that's part of the reason the process is so raw. And so I kind of reversed my process where instead of discarding the tape, I discarded the canvas, the more permanent way of displaying the paintings. So I created my same paintings but on tape, knowing that there was like a non-archival quality to it. And it was sort of representing things that weren't going to last, just as the material they were on isn't going to last. So by using tape with this piece, it's like in the hope that what I guess maybe like America is, or the symbol is, and the negative things it stands for aren't going to last, and it can like become something that is lasting and more beneficial to more people and not full of certain types of hate. And it is the first time where it's kind of both. It's kind of like there's some things you want to be permanent here, and there's things you want to disappear. And I think it's kind of a powerful gesture having it hanging off like that. So that's how I like how the material quality can tie into the content in that way specifically. So, yeah.
Just a reminder, if anyone does have questions, they can please submit them online and we will ask Tim. I have a question that I guess refers more to like your general body of work again. Yeah. I know you talked about like the absence of people, which I think is really kind of fascinating within space. And one of the things that it always makes me think of is this series of photographs of like Norwegian cities during the midnight sun, and it's just the city and there's like no one in there. And so there's always something a little bit off about it because of that missing element. So can you talk about that missing
like,
element?
I mean, you said it, it's like, there's always something a little bit off. So I think many of the spaces I'm photographing that I'm experiencing, like it does feel like there's something off. And then the issues I'm talking about, you know, like the negative issues. So like fake news, misinformation, climate change. It's like, these are things that are off with the world, and I'm noticing them, and I want to do something to point them out. And some of it might seem obvious, or like criticism I've gotten is like, yeah, like we know, or like, why do we need you to tell us that? And it's like, I mean, maybe you don't, but like maybe some people do. And like that in itself is like, do you, just because you know that, someone might not. So I think I'm just like drawn to that, and I want to. That's a way, an inspiration of like something to make work about, is like showcasing what is off in the way I do it, and pointing that out. It's like, I don't feel like I have to. It just like, it seems like I want to, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, there's something ominous about that lack of
something powerful.
People. Yeah. Did you ever paint people? Like,
yeah.
Yeah,
I have. I think I just like the power or the inspiration just like didn't really sync up in that way. And it's like, as artists, it's like, what are we good at, and what are we inspired by, and like, what can we do? You know what I mean? And it's like all those things coming together. I think that kind of dictates the work we do, you know?
Yeah. This flag piece, again, I think is a little bit of a departure from some of your other pieces, in that it doesn't really like depict a physical space as much as it kind of talks maybe about like the space that we're in. Is that like, I mean, did you feel that like when you were going into it? Like, how did you kind of approach?
Yeah, it was definitely, it's like, you know, it's kind of the only piece where, you know, you still don't know exactly, but you know what it's gonna look like and read like in the end, like the composition and the feel of how the piece looks. It's almost like it's the first time I didn't need landscape to talk about a landscape, you know? And it is one of my most recent pieces, my most recent piece that's on display. And maybe it's like a new path where I can kind of start to eliminate some of that literal use of the landscape to talk about these like issues, you know. I don't know. It's exciting in that way, I think. So it could be an evolution past that. Yeah.
I know you teach as well. Do you talk to your students kind of like about using like with using the flag? I know with the history of it, there's always the symbolism and you know, ideas that people bring to that image. But are those things that like you talk to your students about? Like, how do they kind of think about?
It's kind of like ownership. Like, what do you have ownership over it to talk about, or like kind of what are you allowed to, or if you do this, here's what it says. I think that's what I try to talk about to my students, especially when we're doing like I teach a lot of beginning courses and stuff, but like near the end we kind of have freer projects where they get to have their own ideas, I'd say. And it's like, you need to be aware a little bit of like what you're doing, what is that saying? And like I institute critiques like early on just to kind of talk about like what people think and how things are reading. So I wouldn't want to tell them like there's something off the limits per se, but I want them to understand of kind of like what they're biting off and like what they're now taking ownership over when it comes to their work. And I thought about, you know, it's the same way with this piece. I just like, what are you comfortable with doing and how's it read? And like, what's the risk you're willing to take a little bit too, you know? And it's like, you need to be conscious of that, for sure. So I would talk to that with them a little bit. Hopefully I can more when I'm like teaching more advanced classes too. So.
Do we have any, I don't have any final questions from the audience. Anyone want to chime in before we wrap it up? Did you have any last comments or?
No, just thanks very much for tuning in and hope you enjoyed it. And hopefully I have shows later where, you know, we can do this, but I can talk to you in person. So.
I did have one more question.
Yeah.
We love his t-shirt. Where did he get it?
Well, they're right over here, but I got this at a previous installation of artist Robert Buck, who was in this exhibition when he was actually able to engage physically in the spaces in the towns. But you can come to this show and you can get one just like it. So yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm sorry, we were going to say something.
No, it's okay.
All right, well, I think we're going to wrap it up. Thanks everyone for joining us today. A reminder that this exhibition, The Spaces in Between, will be open through January 3rd. If you can come in and check it out and see Tim's work, and you can also get a t-shirt.
Yep.
Thanks everybody.